For 3,000 years, the Galactic Council had maintained peace through careful diplomacy and measured responses. Species rose and fell, but the ancient protocols remained unchanged. When humanity first arrived at the negotiation tables, the council members saw just another primitive species eager to join their ranks. They had no idea they were about to witness the most catastrophic diplomatic failure in galactic history. What started as routine peace talks would end with humanity walking away from the table, leaving behind shocked alien ambassadors who had just made the deadliest mistake of their civilizations. The humans had offered friendship, cooperation, and shared prosperity. In return, they received arrogance, dismissal, and threats. Now, as human warships gather at the edge of council space, the galaxy's most powerful leaders are beginning to understand a terrifying truth. They had confused humanity's desire for peace with weakness. They were about to learn the difference between a species that chooses diplomacy and one that is incapable of war. The negotiations were over. The real conversation was about to begin. The Nexus station hung in the void between star systems, a massive construct of gleaming metal and crystal that had served as the Galactic Council's primary diplomatic facility for over 2 millennia. Its rotating sections generated artificial gravity for the dozens of species that called the galaxy home, while its neutral location ensured that no single civilization could claim territorial advantage during negotiations. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood before the panoramic viewport in her quarters, watching the swirling colors of the nearby nebula paint ethereal patterns across space. She had been humanity's chief diplomat for 15 years, successfully negotiating trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and cultural exchange programs with 17 different species. Today's meeting, however, would be different. Today, humanity was requesting full membership in the Galactic Council. The door to her quarters chimed softly, and her aide, Commander James Chun, entered carrying a data tablet. His expression was grim, which immediately put Elena on alert. James had served alongside her for 8 years, and she had learned to read his moods like a barometric pressure reading. "The preliminary reports from our intelligence division just came in," James said without preamble. "It's not good news." Elena turned away from the viewport, her reflection briefly catching the starlight before disappearing. "How bad?" "The Corvani delegation has been actively lobbying against our membership application for the past 6 months. They've convinced at least 4 other species that humanity represents a potential threat to galactic stability." James handed her the tablet, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "They're calling us aggressive expansionists and technologically reckless." Elena scrolled through the intelligence summary, her expression growing darker with each line. The Corvani were a proud, ancient species that had dominated their sector of the galaxy for over 5,000 years. They viewed themselves as the rightful leaders of galactic civilization, despite their membership in the supposedly egalitarian council. Their opposition to human membership wasn't entirely surprising, but the depth of their campaign against humanity was both shocking and insulting. "What about our allies?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The Meridians are still supporting us, but they're only 1 vote out of 27. The Zelkari are remaining neutral, which is effectively a vote against us since we need a 2/3 majority. The newer species are too intimidated by the Corvani to take a stand either way." Elena set down the tablet and walked to her desk, where a cup of coffee had grown cold while she prepared for the day's sessions. She had known that gaining council membership wouldn't be easy, but she had hoped that humanity's track record of peaceful cooperation and technological innovation would speak for itself. Apparently, she had been naive. "There's something else," James continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Our military attaché received some interesting information from his contacts in the Council's Defense Division. The Corvani have been building up their fleet strength in sectors adjacent to human space. They claim it's for routine training exercises, but the timing is suspicious." Elena felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. The implications were clear enough. If the Corvani were positioning military assets near human territory while simultaneously campaigning against human membership in the Council, they might be preparing for more than just diplomatic opposition. "Do we have any indication of their ultimate goals?" she asked. "Nothing concrete. But our analysts think they're trying to create a pretext for claiming human space as a protectorate under council law. If they can convince the other members that humanity is too dangerous to govern itself, they could potentially gain legal authority over our colonies. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. The Corvani wanted to use humanity's own application for membership as a weapon against them, turning the council's deliberative process into a means of legitimizing conquest. Elena had seen political maneuvering before, but this level of cynical manipulation was something new in her experience. "How long do we have before the vote?" she asked. 3 days. The formal hearings start tomorrow, and the final vote is scheduled for the end of the week. Elena nodded slowly, her mind already racing through possible strategies. She had spent months preparing for this moment, crafting arguments and building relationships with key council members. Now she would have to completely reassess her approach and find a way to counter the Corvani narrative while advancing humanity's case. The next morning, Elena entered the council's main chamber with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The vast circular room could accommodate representatives from all 27 member species, with each delegation assigned seating that reflected their biological and environmental needs. The aquatic collective's representatives floated in specialized tanks, while the silicon-based Christarch delegation occupied heated podiums designed to prevent their mineral forms from cooling too rapidly. At the center of the chamber, the council's ancient meditation sphere rotated slowly, its surface displaying the symbolic intertwining of all member civilizations. The sight of it usually filled Elena with hope for the future of galactic cooperation. Today, it reminded her of how much humanity stood to lose if the negotiations failed. The Corvani delegation occupied a prominent position near the chamber's primary speaker's platform. Their leader, High Counselor Thekvan, was an imposing figure even by the standards of his species. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with chitinous armor-like skin and, for powerful arms, he embodied the martial prowess that had made the Corvani the dominant military force in their region of the galaxy. As Elena took her place at the podium designated for applicant species, she could feel Thekvan's dark eyes fixed on her with unconcealed hostility. She had met him several times during preliminary negotiations, and each encounter had reinforced her impression that he viewed humanity as an unwelcome intruder in what he considered the natural order of galactic civilization. The session's moderator, a dignified member of the ethereal Vorthan species, called the assembly to order with a harmonic tone that resonated through the chamber's acoustic systems. "We gather today to consider the application of the Human Federation for full membership in the Galactic Council. As per our established protocols, we will hear testimony from both the applicant species and any member civilizations who wish to offer their perspectives." Elena stood and activated her translation matrix, ensuring that her words would be clearly understood by all species present. "Honored counselors, I come before you today not just as a representative of humanity, but as someone who believes deeply in the principles that bind this council together. For the past 20 years, the Human Federation has worked tirelessly to prove our commitment to peaceful cooperation and mutual prosperity." She gestured toward a holographic display that materialized above the chamber's center, showing images of human colonies, research stations, and diplomatic facilities. "We have established trade relationships with 14 council species, resulting in technological and cultural exchanges that have benefited all parties involved. Our scientists have shared breakthrough discoveries in medical research, energy production, and agricultural development. Our explorers have charted new hyperspace routes that have reduced travel times between distant sectors by an average of 30%. The display shifted to show images of joint human-alien research teams, mixed crews aboard trading vessels, and diplomatic ceremonies celebrating successful negotiations. Elena had carefully selected each image to emphasize humanity's collaborative approach and positive contributions to galactic society. "We stand before you today not as supplicants seeking favor, but as partners ready to shoulder the responsibilities of full council membership," Elena continued. "We offer our strength in defense of galactic peace, our knowledge in service of scientific advancement, and our commitment to the principle that no species should stand alone in the vastness of space." As she spoke, Elena noticed some encouraging signs among the assembled delegates. The Meridian representative was nodding approvingly, and several of the smaller species seemed genuinely interested in her presentation. However, the Corvani delegation remained stone-faced, and she could see Thek Van making notes on a data tablet with what appeared to be barely controlled impatience. When Elena concluded her opening statement, the moderator invited any council members who wished to respond. Thek Van immediately activated his speaking privileges, rising from his seat with deliberate theatricality. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the deep, resonant tones that characterized Corvani's speech. "We must carefully consider the implications of granting membership to a species that has demonstrated such concerning patterns of behavior." Elena felt her jaw clench, but she maintained her diplomatic composure as Thek Van continued his attack. "The humans speak eloquently of cooperation and peace, yet their own history tells a different story. They are a species born from conflict, shaped by millennia of warfare among their own kind. Even now, as they seek our acceptance, they maintain military forces that dwarf those of many council members. Their technology advances at a rate that should concern us all, particularly in areas related to weapons development and defensive systems." The holographic display shifted without Elena's authorization, now showing images of human military vessels, weapons testing, and historical footage from Earth's various conflicts. She realized that the Corvani had somehow gained access to the chamber's presentation systems, a breach of protocol that should have been impossible. "I do not question their stated intentions," Thek Van continued, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "But we must ask ourselves whether a species so recently emerged from primitive barbarism can truly adapt to the responsibilities of galactic citizenship. Their rapid expansion into previously unclaimed systems shows a concerning disregard for established territorial boundaries. Their technological development prioritizes military applications over peaceful pursuits. Their very genetics predispose them toward aggression and territorial competition." Elena felt her anger rising as Thek Van systematically distorted humanity's record and motivations. Every achievement he mentioned was reframed as evidence of human duplicity or aggression. Their medical research became biological weapons development. Their exploration became territorial expansion. Their defensive preparations became proof of hostile intentions. The most infuriating aspect was how skillfully he mixed truth with insinuation. Humans did have a history of conflict, but so did virtually every species that had achieved interstellar travel. Their military was substantial, but it was also entirely defensive in nature and had never been used aggressively against another species. Their expansion into unclaimed systems was both legal under galactic law and necessary for their growing population. As Thek Van spoke, Elena noticed that several delegations were beginning to look uncertain. The Crystalline Consortium's representative was exchanging what appeared to be concerned communications with his colleagues. The Nebula Dancers, typically supporters of species diversity, seemed troubled by the implications of Thek Van's presentation. When the Corvani leader finally concluded his remarks, Elena requested permission to respond. The moderator granted her request, but she could see in his expression that the damage had already been done. Thek Van had successfully planted seeds of doubt about humanity's intentions and character. "Honored counselors," Elena began, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her chest. "I will not insult your intelligence by claiming that humanity is perfect. We are indeed a young species, and we have made mistakes in our development. However, I must respectfully challenge High Counselor Thek Van's characterization of our history and motivations." She activated her own presentation controls, displaying images of human diplomatic missions, medical aid to disaster-stricken worlds, and joint scientific projects with alien species. Every species in this chamber has a history of conflict in their past. The Corvani themselves conquered no fewer than 12 neighboring civilizations during their own expansion phase. The difference is not whether we have known war, but what we have learned from it. Elena paused, making eye contact with as many delegates as she could. Humanity's military strength exists for one purpose: to ensure that we never again experience the vulnerability that led to our conflicts. We seek membership in this council not to impose our will on others, but to join a community where disputes are resolved through words rather than weapons. The chamber fell silent as Elena concluded her rebuttal. She had done her best to counter Thekvan's narrative, but she could see that uncertainty still lingered among many of the delegates. The Corvani had succeeded in turning humanity's application into a question of galactic security rather than mutual benefit. As the session adjourned for the day, Elena gathered her materials with growing determination. Thekvan had shown his hand, revealing not just opposition but active hostility toward human membership. The question now was whether Elena could find a way to overcome the fear and suspicion he had so skillfully cultivated. Walking back to her quarters, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during the day's proceedings. The Corvani weren't just opposing human membership, they were actively working to undermine humanity's standing in the galactic community. The implications of that realization would prove more significant than she could have imagined. The morning of the second day brought troubling news from multiple sources. Elena had barely finished her breakfast when James burst into her quarters, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of what he carried. "We've got problems," he announced without preamble. 3 more delegations shifted to opposition overnight, and the Corvani have called for an emergency session to address what they're calling new security concerns regarding humanity. Elena set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, using the moment to process this development. What kind of security concerns? They're claiming that our defensive fleet movements in the Outer Rim constitute preparation for aggressive action against Council member territories. Apparently, our routine patrol rotations are being characterized as threatening military buildup. The absurdity of the accusation would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. The human fleets in the Outer Rim were conducting standard defensive patrols in response to increased piracy in the region. Several council member species had actually requested increased human presence to protect their trading vessels from raiders. Do we have documentation proving the defensive nature of our operations? Elena asked. Complete records, including communication logs with the affected species requesting our assistance. But that's not the real problem. James activated a holographic display showing tactical data. Our intelligence assets have detected significant Corvani fleet movements over the past 72 hours. They're positioning major battle groups within striking distance of human colonies in 3 different sectors. Elena studied the tactical display, noting the strategic placement of Corvani forces. The positioning was too coordinated to be coincidental, and the timing strongly suggested that their accusations against humanity were part of a larger plan. They're manufacturing a crisis, she realized aloud. They make accusations about human aggression while positioning their own forces for potential attack. If we respond to their military buildup, they can claim we're proving their point about our aggressive nature. If we don't respond, we leave our colonies vulnerable. That's how our military analysts read it too. Admiral Harrison has requested permission to redeploy additional defensive forces, but that would only give the Corvani more ammunition for their propaganda campaign. Elena walked to her viewport, gazing out at the peaceful scene of ships moving to and from the station. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were discussing potential warfare while surrounded by the ultimate symbol of galactic cooperation. What's our read on the other delegations? Can we count on anyone to see through this charade? The Meridians are standing firm with us, and the Ethereal Collective has expressed private concerns about Corvani aggression. But most of the smaller species are too intimidated to take a public stand. The Zelkari are wavering, which is particularly concerning since they're one of the larger voting blocs. Elena nodded grimly. The Zelkari Confederation represented 7 allied species and commanded significant respect within the council. Their support could sway several undecided delegations, but their opposition would likely doom humanity's membership bid. Schedule a private meeting with the Zelkari delegation. I want to present our case directly, away from Corvani grandstanding. Already tried. They declined, citing the need to maintain neutrality during the deliberation process. The systematic nature of the opposition was becoming clear. The Corvani weren't just arguing against human membership. They were orchestrating a comprehensive campaign to isolate humanity diplomatically while positioning themselves militarily. Elena's communication console chimed, indicating an incoming priority message. The sender identification showed it was from Admiral Sarah Harrison, the commanding officer of human forces in the region. Ambassador Vasquez. Admiral Harrison's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. I need to brief you on some developments that could affect your negotiations. Go ahead, Admiral. We've detected Corvani reconnaissance probes conducting deep scans of our defensive installations around New Geneva and Harmony Station. These aren't routine sensor sweeps. They're detailed tactical intelligence gathering. My tactical staff believes they're mapping our defensive capabilities in preparation for potential offensive action. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. New Geneva was humanity's primary colonial administration center, while Harmony Station served as the main hub for human trade operations in the region. Both installations were heavily populated with civilian personnel who would be unable to defend themselves against military action. What are your recommendations, Admiral? I'm requesting permission to bring additional defensive assets into the region and to begin evacuating non-essential personnel from the most vulnerable installations. However, I want you to understand that these actions will likely be detected by Corvani intelligence and could be used to support their claims about human military aggression. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. If she authorized military preparations, she would give the Corvani exactly the evidence they needed to justify their opposition to human membership. If she refused, she could be condemning thousands of civilians to potential attack. Admiral, in your professional judgment, what is the likelihood of actual Corvani military action? Based on their current positioning and intelligence-gathering activities, I'd estimate a 60% probability of some form of aggressive action within the next 2 weeks. They're following classic pre-attack preparation patterns. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena had hoped that the Corvani opposition was purely political, an attempt to maintain their dominant position within the council through diplomatic maneuvering. The possibility that they were preparing for actual warfare changed everything. I need time to consider our options, Elena said finally. In the meantime, begin discreet preparations for civilian evacuation, but take no overt military action without my explicit authorization. Understood. I'll keep our forces on defensive alert and prepare contingency plans for multiple scenarios. After ending the communication, Elena sat in silence for several minutes, contemplating the magnitude of the crisis developing around humanity's membership application. What had begun as a diplomatic challenge was rapidly evolving into a potential military confrontation that could devastate human colonies and shatter the peace that had prevailed in the galaxy for over a century. James had remained quiet during her conversation with Admiral Harrison, but his expression showed that he understood the gravity of the situation. There's one more thing, he said reluctantly. I've been monitoring communication patterns among the various delegations, and there's been a significant increase in encrypted traffic between the Corvani and several of the species that have shifted to opposition. It's possible they're offering incentives for support. What kind of incentives? Trade concessions, territorial rights, military protection agreements. The classic tools of diplomatic coercion. Several of the smaller species have outstanding territorial disputes or resource conflicts that the Corvani could help resolve. Elena felt her anger building, not just at the Corvani tactics, but at the willingness of other species to compromise their principles for short-term gain. The Galactic Council had been founded on the principle that all civilized species deserved equal representation and protection. The Corvani were systematically undermining those principles while wrapping their actions in the rhetoric of galactic security. I want a complete analysis of every delegation's voting patterns and recent agreements with the Corvani. If they're buying opposition, we need to understand the full scope of their operation. Already underway. But, Elena, we need to consider the possibility that we're not going to win this vote. Even if we can prove Corvani manipulation, the damage to our reputation may be irreversible. Elena knew he was right, but she wasn't ready to accept defeat. Too much depended on the outcome of these negotiations, not just for humanity, but for the future of galactic civilization. If the Corvani could successfully manipulate the Council to reject a qualified species based on manufactured concerns, It would set a precedent that could be used against any species that threatened their dominance. Schedule a meeting with the Ethereal Collective's delegation. They've been around long enough to see through Corvani games, and they might be willing to take a stand. The Ethereals prefer to work behind the scenes. They rarely take public positions on controversial issues. Then, we'll work behind the scenes too. I want to explore every possible avenue before we consider surrender. The emergency session called by the Corvani took place that afternoon in a smaller chamber, typically reserved for security briefings. Elena found herself facing a panel of 12 council members, including Thekvan and representatives from each of the major power blocks. The Corvani leader wasted no time in presenting his case, activating a tactical display that showed human fleet positions throughout the region. Esteemed colleagues, these images were taken within the past 72 hours. As you can see, human military forces have been repositioned in a pattern that suggests preparation for offensive operations against multiple council member territories. Elena studied the display, recognizing the locations but seeing them presented in a completely distorted context. The human ships shown were indeed conducting patrols, but they were responding to specific requests for protection from the very council members who were now sitting in judgment. High Counselor Thekvan. Elena interjected when the presentation paused. Those patrol routes were established at the specific request of the Altarian Commerce Guild and the Syndicate of Free Traders, both council members who reported increased piracy in their shipping lanes. So you claim, Thekvan replied smoothly. However, we must consider the possibility that these requests for protection were manufactured by human agents to justify military positioning. The pattern of deployment suggests an intention to establish choke points that could control trade routes throughout the region. The accusation was so absurd that Elena almost laughed. The idea that humanity had somehow coerced multiple independent species into requesting protection so they could position their fleet strategically required a level of conspiracy thinking that bordered on paranoia. Do you have any evidence to support this accusation? Elena asked. I have evidence of human military expansion occurring simultaneously with their application for council membership, Thekvan responded. I have evidence of increased human technological development in military-related fields. I have evidence of territorial expansion that exceeds the normal growth patterns of a developing civilization. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it. Elena realized that she was facing a master manipulator who could twist any fact to support his predetermined conclusions. Thekvan wasn't interested in honest evaluation of human activities. He was building a narrative that would justify predetermined actions. What exactly are you proposing? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I propose that the Council establish a temporary protectorate over human space while conducting a comprehensive review of their military capabilities and territorial claims. This would ensure galactic security while providing humanity with the guidance they need to develop into responsible galactic citizens. The audacity of the proposal took Elena's breath away. Thekvan was essentially asking the Council to authorize the conquest of human space under the guise of protective oversight. The fact that he could make such a suggestion with a straight face while positioning military forces for attack demonstrated a level of cynicism that Elena had never encountered in her diplomatic career. The Human Federation categorically rejects any form of external oversight or protectorate status, Elena stated firmly. We are a sovereign civilization fully capable of governing ourselves and managing our own affairs. Your rejection only reinforces concerns about your species' willingness to cooperate with galactic authority, Thekvan replied. A truly peaceful species would welcome council guidance and oversight. Elena saw the trap closing around her. Any resistance to Corvani demands would be characterized as evidence of human aggression, while submission would legitimize their conquest. There was no middle ground that wouldn't ultimately serve Corvani interests. As the session continued, Elena watched the faces of the other council members, trying to gauge their reactions to the increasingly extreme proposals. Some looked uncomfortable with the direction of the discussion, but none seemed willing to openly challenge Thekvan's narrative. When the session finally adjourned, Elena walked back to her quarters with the growing realization that the situation had moved beyond diplomatic resolution. The Corvani weren't interested in negotiation or compromise. They wanted capitulation or war. The carefully constructed framework of galactic diplomacy was being dismantled before her eyes by a species that valued power above principle. That evening, as Elena prepared her final arguments for humanity's membership application, she received another communication from Admiral Harrison. Ambassador, we've detected additional Corvani fleet movements. They're now positioning forces within 1 day's travel of 7 human colony worlds. My recommendation is immediate evacuation of civilian populations and mobilization of all available defensive assets. Elena stared at the tactical display showing Corvani ships moving into attack positions around human space. The pretense of diplomatic opposition had been abandoned. The Corvani were preparing for war regardless of how the council vote proceeded. Admiral, I need you to be completely honest with me. If the Corvani attack our colonies, what are our chances of successfully defending them? In a straight military engagement, our forces are roughly equivalent to theirs. However, if they have council authorization for their actions, other species might provide support or at least refuse to assist our defense. In that scenario, our chances drop significantly. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility for millions of human lives. The diplomatic process she had devoted her career to serving was about to fail in the most catastrophic way possible. Prepare for all contingencies, Admiral. I fear we may be beyond the point where diplomacy can resolve this situation. The final day of negotiations dawned with ominous news filtering through intelligence channels. Elena stood in her quarters, reviewing reports that painted an increasingly dire picture of galactic politics and military positioning. The Corvani had spent the night consolidating support through a combination of promises, threats, and what could only be described as outright bribery. Commander Chen entered with a data tablet containing the overnight developments. His expression had moved beyond grim into something approaching despair. The vote count isn't looking good, he reported without ceremony. We have confirmed support from 7 delegations, possible support from 3 more, and firm opposition from 17. Even if we get every possible vote, we're still 3 short of the 2/3 majority needed for approval. Elena accepted the tablet and scanned the breakdown. The mathematics of political failure were laid out in stark detail, but what troubled her more was the pattern of opposition. Species that had previously maintained cordial relationships with humanity were now actively supporting the Corvani position. What changed their minds? She asked, though she suspected the answer involved the kind of diplomatic coercion that the Galactic Council was supposedly designed to prevent. The Altarian Commerce Guild was offered exclusive trading rights in 2 Corvani-controlled systems in exchange for their opposition vote. The Syndicate of Free Traders was promised military protection for their shipping lanes. The Crystal Collective was given assurances that their territorial dispute with the Void Runners would be resolved in their favor. Elena felt sick. The species that had requested human protection from pirates were now voting against human membership because the Corvani had offered them alternative arrangements. The cynicism was breathtaking, but she couldn't entirely blame them. From their perspective, they were simply choosing the strongest protector available. What about the threats? Elena asked, knowing that the Corvani wouldn't rely solely on positive incentives. Several of the smaller species were told that opposition to humanity was a test of their loyalty to galactic stability. Those who failed the test might find themselves facing similar security reviews in the future. It's sophisticated intimidation disguised as policy discussion. Elena set down the tablet and walked to her viewport, watching the constant stream of traffic moving around the station. Ships from dozens of species went about their peaceful business, seemingly unaware that the entire foundation of galactic civilization was crumbling around them. There's something else, James continued reluctantly. Our intelligence sources indicate that the Corvani have prepared a formal declaration of protectorate status over human space, regardless of how the membership vote proceeds. They're planning to present it as a necessary security measure to protect both humanity and the broader galactic community. The audacity was stunning. The Corvani had manipulated the membership process to create a pretext for conquest while maintaining the appearance of legal authority. They would claim that humanity's rejection by the Council proved their unfitness for self-governance, justifying the imposition of Corvani control. Do we have any options left? Elena asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. The Ethereal Collective's delegation has requested a private meeting. They claim to have information that could change the situation, but they won't discuss details through normal communication channels. Elena felt a flutter of hope. The Ethereals were ancient, wise, and had a reputation for seeing through political manipulation. If anyone could find a way to expose the Corvani's true agenda, it would be them. When and where? 1 hour from now, in the meditation gardens on level 7. They insist on absolute privacy. Elena nodded and began preparing for what might be humanity's last chance for a diplomatic solution. As she gathered her materials, her communication console chimed with an incoming message from Earth. The sender identification showed it was from President Martinez, humanity's elected leader. Elena. The president's recorded voice carried a weariness that reflected the burden of leading a species facing potential extinction. I've received Admiral Harrison's latest reports on Corvani military positioning. The situation has moved beyond diplomatic resolution. I'm authorizing you to make whatever decisions you believe are necessary to protect human lives and interests. The full weight of our civilization's future rests on your judgment. The message continued with specific authorization codes and contingency instructions, but Elena barely heard them. The president had essentially given her complete diplomatic authority, including the power to commit humanity to actions that could have consequences for generations. 30 minutes later, Elena made her way to the station's meditation gardens, a tranquil area designed to provide respite from the intense political discussions that dominated the station's purpose. The gardens contained plants and environmental elements from dozens of worlds, creating a space that felt peaceful and contemplative despite the artificial nature of its construction. The Ethereal Collective's representative, known simply as Whisper, materialized near a grove of crystalline trees that chimed softly in the artificial breeze. The Ethereals were energy beings who could take physical form when necessary, but preferred to exist as patterns of organized consciousness. Whisper's current manifestation appeared as a vaguely humanoid figure composed of shifting light and shadow. Ambassador Vasquez. Whisper's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a characteristic of their communication method. We have observed the proceedings with great concern. The Corvani are dismantling principles that have maintained galactic peace for millennia. Can you help us expose their manipulation? Elena asked directly. We have evidence of their bribery and intimidation, but we need a respected voice to present it to the council. Evidence of corruption is less important than understanding the deeper game being played, Whisper replied enigmatically. The Corvani seek more than the rejection of human membership. They seek to establish a precedent for unilateral action against any species they deem threatening. Elena felt a chill of understanding. If the Corvani could successfully manipulate the Council into authorizing action against humanity, they would have created a mechanism for controlling or eliminating any species that might challenge their dominance in the future. What do you know about their ultimate plans? Elena asked. Our collective consciousness has detected unusual patterns in galactic communication networks. The Corvani have been conducting secret negotiations with several client species about post-human territorial divisions. They are planning not just conquest, but the complete absorption of human space into their sphere of influence. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than Elena had imagined. The Corvani weren't simply opposing human membership. They were orchestrating the systematic destruction of humanity as an independent civilization. Can the Ethereal Collective take action to stop this? Elena asked, though she suspected that the Ethereal's non-interference policy would prevent direct intervention. We cannot act directly without abandoning principles we have maintained for thousands of years. However, we can provide you with information that might allow you to act more effectively. Whisper's form shifted, becoming more solid and focused. The Corvani fleet positioning is more extensive than your intelligence services have detected. They have positioned forces to strike simultaneously at 12 human colonies, including your homeworld. The attack is scheduled to begin 6 hours after the council vote, regardless of the outcome. Elena's blood turned cold. The Corvani had moved beyond using the diplomatic process as cover for military action. They were planning a coordinated assault designed to cripple human civilization in a single stroke. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked. Because the Ethereal Collective believes that the principle of self-determination is fundamental to galactic civilization. The Corvani thread extends beyond humanity to any species that values independence over subjugation. Today it is humans. Tomorrow it could be any of us. Elena felt the weight of terrible knowledge settling on her shoulders. The diplomatic process had been a sham from the beginning. The Corvani had already decided on war. The council proceedings were simply theater designed to provide legal justification for predetermined actions. What would you recommend? Elena asked. You have a choice that will define not just humanity's future, but the future of galactic civilization. You can continue to seek approval from a corrupted process, or you can take action to preserve your species' right to exist. Elena understood the implications. Whisper was suggesting that humanity abandon the diplomatic process and take unilateral action to protect itself. Such action would be condemned by the Council and would likely lead to humanity being branded as an aggressor species. If we act to defend ourselves, will any species support us? Elena asked. Some will, though they may not be able to acknowledge their support publicly. Others will condemn your actions while secretly admiring your courage. The galaxy has grown complacent under Corvani dominance, but many species remember what it means to be truly free. Elena thanked Whisper for the information and made her way back to her quarters, her mind racing through options and consequences. The choice before her was stark: submit to Corvani manipulation and watch her species be conquered, or abandon diplomacy and fight for humanity's right to exist independently. When she arrived at her quarters, James was waiting with Admiral Harrison on a secure communication link. Both men could see from her expression that something fundamental had changed. The Ethereals have confirmed our worst fears, Elena announced without preamble. The Corvani are planning a coordinated assault on 12 human colonies, including Earth. The attack begins 6 hours after the Council vote. Admiral Harrison's expression hardened. Ma'am, with that intelligence, I strongly recommend immediate preemptive action. If we allow them to strike first, we'll be fighting from a position of devastating disadvantage. Elena felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The decision she made in the next few minutes would echo through the centuries, defining not just how humanity was remembered, but whether humanity would survive to be remembered at all. James, I need you to prepare a statement for immediate transmission to all council members and their governments. The statement will explain why humanity is withdrawing from the membership application process and what actions we're taking to defend ourselves. Elena, James said carefully, once we take this step, there's no going back. We'll be abandoning any chance of peaceful resolution. The chance for peaceful resolution died the moment the Corvani decided to use diplomacy as a weapon, Elena replied. Admiral Harrison, you are authorized to implement all defensive measures necessary to protect human lives and territory. Consider this a formal declaration of our intent to defend ourselves by any means necessary. Understood, Ambassador. My forces are ready to act on your authority. Elena walked to her viewport one final time, looking out at the peaceful scene of interstellar cooperation that had been her life's work. In a few hours, that peace would be shattered, and humanity would stand alone against forces that sought to destroy everything they had built. But they would stand, and they would fight, and perhaps, in doing so, they would remind the galaxy what it meant to be free. Execute all defensive protocols, Elena ordered, and send a message to every human colony. The negotiations are over. Now we show them who we really are. The die was cast. Humanity would abandon the failed promise of galactic diplomacy and chart its own course through the stars. The consequences would be severe, but they would be faced on humanity's terms rather than accepted from their knees. The real conversation was about to begin, and it would be conducted in the language that the Corvani understood best, the language of strength. The emergency transmission from Elena reached every human military command within 3 hours, triggering protocols that had been developed but never tested on such a scale. Across human space, defensive preparations that had begun as cautious precautions transformed into urgent mobilization efforts as the scope of the Corvani threat became clear. Admiral Sarah Harrison stood in the command center of the dreadnought Unconquerable, watching tactical displays that showed the deployment of human forces across 12 star systems. The irony of the ship's name wasn't lost on her as she prepared to test whether humanity's defensive capabilities could match its determination. Admiral, her chief of staff, Captain Torres, approached with the latest intelligence updates. Our deep space monitoring stations have detected additional Corvani fleet movements. They're committing more forces to this operation than our original estimates suggested. Harrison studied the tactical display, noting the methodical positioning of Corvani battle groups around human space. The pattern revealed a level of planning that must have taken months to coordinate, confirming that humanity's diplomatic efforts had been doomed from the beginning. How many ships are we looking at total? Harrison asked. Conservative estimate puts it at over 600 Corvani vessels, including at least 40 heavy cruisers and 12 dreadnought-class ships. They've also got support from 3 client species who've committed another 200 ships to the operation. The numbers were sobering. Humanity could field approximately 400 ships of various classes, but many of those were stationed too far from the projected attack sites to provide immediate assistance. The Corvani had achieved both numerical superiority and tactical positioning. What about our allies? Harrison inquired, though she suspected the answer would be disappointing. The Meridian Republic has quietly moved a battle group to the edge of the conflict zone, but they can't officially participate without Council authorization. The Ethereal Collective has withdrawn all their vessels from the area, claiming neutrality. Most of the other species are either intimidated into silence or actively supporting the Corvani. Harrison nodded grimly. Humanity would face the crisis largely alone, just as their ancestors had faced countless challenges throughout their history. The difference was that this time, the survival of their entire civilization hung in the balance. Status of civilian evacuations? Harrison asked. Approximately 60% complete. The outer colonies have been easier to evacuate, but Earth and the major population centers are still vulnerable. We need at least 18 more hours to get everyone to safety. We may not have 18 hours. Order all evacuation efforts to prioritize children and essential personnel. Everyone else needs to understand that they might have to shelter in place. On the Nexus station, Elena was conducting her own form of warfare. She had called for an emergency session of the Galactic Council, ostensibly to address urgent security concerns affecting human space. The Corvani delegation had no choice but to attend, despite their obvious preference to proceed with military action rather than continue diplomatic theater. Elena stood before the assembled delegates with the knowledge that this would likely be her final appearance as humanity's ambassador to the galaxy. The weight of that realization was both liberating and terrifying. "Honored counselors," she began, her voice carrying a steel that hadn't been present in earlier sessions. "I stand before you today to inform you that humanity is withdrawing its application for membership in the Galactic Council, effective immediately." A murmur of surprise rippled through the chamber. Several delegates seemed genuinely shocked, while others appeared to be calculating the implications of this unexpected development. "Furthermore," Elena continued, "I must inform this assembly that the Human Federation has detected imminent military threats against our civilian populations. We will be taking all necessary measures to defend our people and our territory." Thekvan rose from his seat, his forearms spreading in a gesture of apparent confusion and concern. "Ambassador Vasquez, this is highly irregular. If humanity has security concerns, the proper course is to submit them to Council review and allow us to investigate these threats through established procedures." Elena fixed him with a stare that could have melted armor plating. "High Counselor, we have submitted our concerns through established procedures. We have documented evidence of military threats, territorial positioning, and systematic diplomatic manipulation. The response has been to characterize our legitimate security measures as evidence of aggressive intent." She activated a holographic display that showed the current positioning of Corvani forces around human space. The tactical situation was laid out in undeniable detail, with timestamps and movement patterns that revealed the coordinated nature of the deployment. "These images were taken within the past 6 hours, Elena announced. "They show over 800 hostile vessels positioned to strike simultaneously at 12 human colony worlds. This force includes ships from 4 different species, all coordinating under Corvani command authority. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. Several species that had committed ships to the Corvani operation looked distinctly uncomfortable at having their participation exposed so publicly. I call upon this council to explain how such a massive military operation could be organized without council knowledge or authorization, Elena challenged. I call upon those species who have committed forces to this operation to explain their justifications for participating in what can only be described as an unprovoked assault on a peaceful civilization. Thekvan's composure finally cracked, revealing the fury that had been building throughout the diplomatic process. The Corvani Empire will not be lectured by representatives of a species that refuses to accept galactic authority. Your withdrawal from the membership process proves what we have said all along about human arrogance and unfitness for civilization. Our withdrawal proves that we refuse to participate in a corrupted process designed to legitimize conquest, Elena shot back. The Galactic Council was founded on principles of equality, self-determination, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Those principles died the moment you decided to use them as weapons against species that threaten your dominance. Elena could see that her words were having an impact on several delegations. The Crystalline Consortium's representative was exchanging rapid communications with his colleagues, while the Nebula Dancers appeared to be reconsidering their position on the unfolding crisis. I want every member of this council to understand what is happening here, Elena continued, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. Today it is humanity facing Corvani aggression disguised as council authority. Tomorrow it could be any of you who find your independence threatened by species powerful enough to manipulate the very institutions designed to protect you. The ethereal collective's representative, Whisper, materialized more solidly than Elena had ever seen them appear in the council chamber. When they spoke, their voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with something deeper than sound. The ethereal collective has remained neutral in most conflicts for thousands of years, Whisper announced. However, we cannot remain silent when the fundamental principles of galactic civilization are being destroyed. We have evidence of systematic corruption of the council process, including bribery, intimidation, and the coordination of military action without proper authorization. Thekvan turned his attention to Whisper, his anger now fully visible. The ethereal collective has no right to interfere in council deliberations. Your species abandoned physical involvement in galactic affairs centuries ago. We abandoned physical involvement, not moral responsibility, Whisper replied calmly. The principles being violated today affect all species, regardless of their level of physical engagement with galactic politics. Elena seized the opportunity provided by Whisper's intervention. I call for an immediate investigation into Corvani military activities and their manipulation of the council process. I call for the immediate withdrawal of all hostile forces from human space. And I call for the removal of any council authority for military action that was obtained through fraudulent means. This council will authorize no such investigations. Thekvan roared. The Corvani Empire acts under legitimate security concerns documented and supported by multiple council members. Then, this council has abandoned its purpose, Elena stated flatly. Humanity will defend itself through whatever means necessary, and we will hold responsible any species that participates in unprovoked aggression against our people. Elena gathered her materials and walked toward the chamber's exit, her departure creating a symbolic break with the entire diplomatic framework that had brought her to the station. Ambassador Vasquez called the session moderator. You cannot simply leave during official proceedings. Elena turned back one final time. I can, and I am. Humanity no longer recognizes the authority of a body that has been corrupted into an instrument of conquest. We will communicate our positions through actions rather than words. As Elena left the chamber, she could hear heated arguments erupting between various delegations. The careful facade of unity that the Corvani had constructed was crumbling as species began questioning their participation in what was increasingly revealed as a conspiracy rather than legitimate council action. Elena made her way quickly back to her quarters, where James was coordinating with Admiral Harrison and monitoring the galaxy-wide response to humanity's withdrawal from the diplomatic process. How are things developing? Elena asked. Better than expected in some ways, worse in others, James reported. 3 species have announced that they're withdrawing their forces from the Corvani operation, but that still leaves us facing overwhelming odds. On the positive side, several major trade organizations have condemned the Corvani actions and are threatening economic sanctions. Elena felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Humanity's decision to abandon diplomacy and expose the Corvani conspiracy was having consequences throughout the galaxy, but those consequences might not be enough to prevent the impending military assault. What's Admiral Harrison's assessment of our defensive prospects? Elena asked. She's confident that we can make any attack extremely costly, but she's honest about our chances of preventing significant damage to civilian populations. The Corvani have achieved strategic surprise and numerical superiority. Elena nodded, accepting the harsh mathematics of interstellar warfare. Humanity would fight, and they might even achieve some form of victory, but the cost would be enormous. James, I want you to prepare one final communication to be sent to every government in the galaxy. The message should be simple. Humanity offered peace, cooperation, and friendship. In response, we received manipulation, threats, and military assault. We will remember who stood with us and who stood against us when this crisis is resolved. Elena, that sounds almost like a threat. It is a threat, Elena confirmed. The galaxy is about to learn that humans have long memories and that we never forget those who try to destroy us. Today's enemies should consider carefully whether they want to face our vengeance for generations to come. As Elena spoke, reports were coming in from across human space of the final defensive preparations being completed. Orbital defense platforms were powering up, civilian populations were taking shelter, and human warships were moving into positions calculated to maximize the cost of any Corvani assault. The diplomatic phase of the crisis was over. Soon, the galaxy would learn what humanity was capable of when their backs were against the wall, and their survival was at stake. The Corvani had mistaken human desires for peace as evidence of weakness. They were about to discover the difference between a species that preferred peace and one that was incapable of war. The first shots of what would become known as the Corvani War were fired at 14:23 Galactic Standard Time, exactly 6 hours and 17 minutes after the Galactic Council vote that humanity never allowed to proceed. The Corvani had maintained their timeline despite the collapse of their diplomatic cover, launching coordinated assaults against 12 human star systems simultaneously. Admiral Harrison watched the tactical displays from her command center as reports flooded in from across human space. The scope of the assault was even larger than intelligence estimates had suggested, with the Corvani committing over 900 vessels to what they clearly intended as a decisive blow against human civilization. Admiral, Captain Torres reported with barely controlled tension in his voice. New Geneva is under heavy bombardment. The orbital defense platforms are holding, but they're taking significant damage. Admiral Chun is requesting permission to engage the attacking fleet with all available forces. Harrison studied the tactical situation around humanity's primary colonial administration center. The Corvani had committed nearly 100 ships to the assault, including 6 of their massive dreadnought-class vessels. The human defenders were outnumbered 3-1, but they held the advantage of fighting from prepared defensive positions. Permission granted, Harrison authorized. Tell Admiral Chun that his objective is not to win a fleet engagement, but to make the Corvani pay such a high price for their aggression that other species will think twice before joining future attacks. Similar conversations were taking place throughout human space as outnumbered defenders prepared to extract maximum cost from their attackers. The human strategy was brutally simple. Make every Corvani victory so expensive that their empire would be crippled even if they succeeded in conquering human territory. On the Nexus station, Elena watched the battle reports with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Each human ship destroyed represented hundreds of lives lost, but each Corvani vessel eliminated sent a message that would resonate throughout the galaxy for generations. Elena, James approached with the latest intelligence summary. The initial casualty reports are coming in. We've lost approximately 30 ships in the first hour, but the Corvani have lost over 50. More importantly, several of the species that committed forces to their operation are already expressing private concerns about the cost. Elena felt a grim satisfaction. Humanity's technological advances and tactical innovations were proving their worth in the crucible of actual combat. Human ships were individually superior to most of their opponents, and human crews were demonstrating the kind of determination that could only come from fighting for the survival of everything they valued. What about Earth? Elena asked, knowing that the homeworld would be a primary target. The Sol Defense Fleet is engaging a Corvani force of over 200 ships. Admiral Rodriguez reports that the outer defensive perimeter is holding, but the enemy is committing massive resources to breaking through to Earth itself. Elena closed her eyes, imagining the battle raging around humanity's birth world. Billions of people depended on the courage and skill of the defenders who stood between them and annihilation. The weight of responsibility for those lives pressed down on her like a physical force. There's something else, James continued. We're receiving communication attempts from several council member species. Some are offering to mediate a ceasefire, while others are expressing support for our defensive actions. Any offers from species with actual military capability? Elena asked. The Meridian Republic has officially declared their neutrality, but their fleet movements suggest they're positioning for possible intervention on our behalf. The Ethereal Collective has begun jamming Corvani communications in key sectors, claiming it's necessary to prevent interference with their own operations. Elena felt a flicker of hope. Humanity might be fighting largely alone, but they weren't entirely without friends. The galaxy was beginning to understand the true nature of the Corvani threat, and some species were finding ways to assist human defensive efforts without openly violating their neutrality agreements. James, I want you to establish secure communication with any species offering genuine support. We need to coordinate our efforts and ensure that today's events mark the beginning of broader resistance to Corvani expansion rather than just humanity's final stand. As Elena spoke, the tactical displays showed the first major engagement reaching its climax around New Geneva. Admiral Chun had committed his entire defensive fleet to a coordinated assault on the Corvani attack force, accepting the risk of total destruction in exchange for maximum damage to the enemy. The battle raged for over an hour, with human ships using their superior maneuverability and firepower to devastating effect. When the shooting finally stopped, the orbital defense platforms around New Geneva remained intact, and the Corvani assault force had been reduced to less than 30 ships from their original 100. However, the human defenders had paid a terrible price. Admiral Chen's flagship had been destroyed with all hands, and only 15 human vessels remained operational. The colony was saved, but the defensive fleet was shattered. Similar scenes played out across human space as outnumbered defenders made the Corvani pay for every kilometer of space they gained. By the end of the first day of fighting, the strategic situation was complex and fluid, with neither side having achieved their primary objectives. The Corvani had failed to achieve the quick, decisive victory they had planned. Human resistance had proven far more effective than their intelligence estimates had suggested, and the cost of their assault was mounting rapidly. However, human defensive capabilities were being steadily degraded, and several outer colonies had been forced to evacuate under heavy bombardment. Admiral, Captain Torres reported with exhaustion evident in his voice. We're receiving a priority communication from Corvani High Command. They're requesting a ceasefire to discuss terms. Harrison felt a surge of bitter satisfaction. Less than 24 hours earlier, the Corvani had been confident that they could crush human resistance through overwhelming force. Now they were discovering that humans were considerably more dangerous than their peaceful diplomatic approach had suggested. What terms are they proposing? Harrison asked. Essentially a return to the status quo before the attack, with some face-saving language about resolving security concerns through renewed diplomatic engagement. Harrison laughed, a sound devoid of humor. They want to pretend that yesterday never happened? That they didn't launch an unprovoked assault on our colonies? It appears so, Admiral. How should we respond? Harrison considered the offer carefully. A ceasefire would allow human forces to regroup and repair damaged systems, but it would also allow the Corvani to reinforce their positions and prepare for renewed assault. More importantly, accepting a ceasefire now would signal that humanity was willing to negotiate from a position of weakness. Send a response to Corvani High Command, Harrison ordered. Tell them that humanity is prepared to discuss terms, but only after they withdraw all military forces to their pre-attack positions and pay reparations for the damage they've caused to human colonies. Admiral, those terms are completely unacceptable to the Corvani. They'll never agree. I know, Harrison replied grimly. But it's important that the galaxy understands who is willing to negotiate in good faith and who insists on maintaining the gains from unprovoked aggression. On the Nexus station, Elena was receiving similar communications from various council members attempting to broker a ceasefire. The sudden shift in tone was remarkable, considering that most of these same species had either supported or remained silent about the Corvani assault just hours earlier. Ambassador Vasquez, the Meridian Republic's representative, had requested a private meeting. My government is deeply concerned about the escalating violence and its potential to destabilize the entire region. We believe that both sides should consider stepping back from the brink before this conflict expands beyond control. Elena studied the Meridian diplomat carefully. She had worked with him on several previous negotiations and knew him to be generally honest and straightforward in his dealings. Ambassador Keleth, yesterday your government watched silently while the Corvani positioned massive fleets to attack human civilians. Today you express concern about violence. What changed? Keleth's expression showed genuine discomfort. Yesterday we believed we were observing a limited security operation designed to address specific threats. Today we see the reality of Corvani intentions and methods. My government is reassessing many of our previous assumptions about galactic politics. Elena felt a grim satisfaction. The Corvani's mask had finally slipped, revealing their true nature to species that had previously been willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. The cost of that revelation was being paid in human blood, but the knowledge might prove valuable for future galactic politics. What specific assistance is the Meridian Republic prepared to offer? Elena asked directly. We cannot intervene directly without council authorization, but we can provide intelligence, medical supplies, and technical assistance for refugee operations. We can also use our diplomatic channels to pressure other species to reconsider their support for Corvani actions. Elena nodded. It wasn't the military alliance she had hoped for, but it was more than humanity had possessed 24 hours earlier. I appreciate the offer, Ambassador. However, I want you to understand something clearly. Humanity will not accept a return to the previous situation. The Corvani have revealed their true intentions, and we will not pretend that their diplomatic mask can simply be restored. What are you saying? Keleth asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. I'm saying that this conflict will not end until the Corvani threat to galactic peace has been permanently eliminated. They have chosen war over diplomacy, conquest over cooperation. They will have war, but it will not be the easy victory they anticipated. As Elena spoke, reports were arriving of human counterattacks beginning throughout the disputed regions. Rather than simply defending their territories, human commanders were beginning to strike at Corvani supply lines, staging areas, and isolated fleet elements. The defensive phase of the war was ending. Now the galaxy would see what humans were capable of when they took the offensive against enemies who had threatened their survival. Admiral Harrison watched the tactical displays with professional satisfaction as human strike forces began systematic attacks on Corvani infrastructure throughout the region. The enemy had expected to face a desperate defensive effort followed by eventual capitulation. Instead, they were confronting a coordinated campaign designed to destroy their capacity to threaten any species ever again. Admiral, Captain Torres reported with the first hint of optimism he had shown since the crisis began. Our long-range reconnaissance forces have identified the primary Corvani fleet staging area. It's heavily defended, but our analysts believe a concentrated assault could cripple their ability to maintain offensive operations. Harrison studied the intelligence data, noting the massive concentration of enemy forces and support infrastructure. Destroying the staging area would require committing the majority of human fleet assets to a single decisive engagement, with no guarantee of success. What's Admiral Rodriguez's assessment of our capabilities for such an operation? Harrison asked. She believes we have approximately a 40% chance of success if we commit everything to the attack. However, she emphasizes that failure would leave Earth defenseless against Corvani retaliation. Harrison considered the options. A successful attack on the Corvani staging area would effectively end their capacity to threaten human space, but failure would result in the destruction of human civilization. It was the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that would have terrified most military commanders. For humans, it was simply another day ending in the letter Y. Signal all fleet commanders, Harrison ordered. We're going to show the Corvani and the entire galaxy what happens when you threaten humanity's right to exist. Prepare for Operation Reckoning. The die was cast once again, but this time it would land on humanity's terms. The galaxy would learn that humans were far more dangerous as enemies than they had ever been valuable as friends. The Corvani had wanted war. They were about to receive more than they could handle.